The soft hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I lay on the creaky mattress in my room at St. Helena's Psychiatric Facility. It was a place that smelled perpetually of antiseptic and despair, the kind of institution where time stood still, yet every second clawed at your sanity. The nights were the worst. The distant cries of other patients echoed through the halls, but I'd grown used to their sorrowful chorus. What I hadn't grown used to was the sound from the wall beside my bed. It started a week ago, faint at first, a rhythmic whispering, like a chant spoken just below the edge of perception. My chest tightened every time I heard it. There was no logical explanation. The room next to mine had been empty for months, and yet, night after night, the whispers persisted. Then came the singing, a haunting melody that clung to the air like cobwebs, delicate yet suffocating. It wasn't a song I recognized, and the voice. It sounded like a child's, high-pitched and tremulous, as though carried from a faraway place. "Do you hear that?" I asked Greg, the orderly, one morning as he brought my medication. "Hear what, Max?" His tone was tired, dismissive. He handed me the little paper cup with the pills. "You've got to stop overthinking things." But it wasn't in my head. That night, the singing grew louder, and I pressed my ear to the wall. The sound was unmistakably coming from within, as though someone or something was trapped inside. I felt the vibrations, faint but real, reverberating against my skin. My pulse quickened as a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. "Hello," I whispered, my voice trembling. The singing stopped abruptly. A second passed. Then two. My heart thundered in my chest. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, it replied, "Come play with us." The morning after that chilling reply, I could barely focus during group therapy. My hands trembled, and my mind raced as Dr. Callahan droned on about mindfulness and grounding exercises. The whispers and singing had left me shaken, but that voice, soft, insidious, had rooted itself in my thoughts like a parasite. After the session, I cornered Nurse Evelyn in the hallway. She was kind enough, one of the few staff members who didn't treat us like lost causes. Her auburn hair was tied back in a tight bun, and her pale green scrubs swished softly as she walked. "Evelyn," I blurted, stepping into her path. My throat felt dry. "I need to ask you something. It's about the room next to mine." Her face tensed, her usually warm demeanor flickering with unease. "What about it, Max? Every night, I hear things. Whispers. Singing." My voice cracked, and I hated how desperate I sounded. "There's no one in there, right? It's empty." She didn't answer right away, her lips pressing into a thin line. For a moment, I thought she might brush me off like Greg had. But then she glanced around, ensuring we were alone. "Max," she began, lowering her voice, "that room has been closed for years, after the renovations." "What renovations?" I pressed. Her eyes darted to the end of the hallway as though the walls themselves might overhear. "I shouldn't be telling you this," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Years ago, there was an incident. A child, passed away in that room. Afterward, the staff decided to seal it off. There was no budget to remodel properly, so they just boarded it up behind a layer of plaster." The blood drained from my face. "A child." She nodded but didn't elaborate. "No one's supposed to talk about it. It's just easier that way." Her words were a lead weight in my chest. "But the noises—" "Enough, Max," she hissed, cutting me off. Her usual kind expression was replaced with a sharp edge of fear. "It's probably your imagination. You need to focus on your recovery." She walked away quickly, leaving me rooted to the spot. But it wasn't my imagination. I knew what I had heard. That night, as the whispers returned, I made a decision. I had to find out what was behind that wall. That night, the whispers began earlier than usual, soft but insistent. They were louder now, each syllable dragging across my nerves like nails on glass. The faint singing returned too, the melody haunting and hollow. I sat on my bed, staring at the wall, my breath shallow and quick. A shiver crawled up my spine as the voice whispered again, "Come play with us." My heart pounded. I couldn't just sit there. I needed to know what was hidden behind the plaster. Steeling myself, I searched my small room for something, anything, that could help. My eyes landed on the broken mop in the corner, left there after one of the cleaning staff had forgotten to collect it. I gripped its splintered wooden handle tightly and crossed the room. The plaster felt cold beneath my fingertips as I knocked. The sound was hollow, deceptively empty. My grip tightened on the mop handle, and I swung it against the wall. The plaster cracked, sending a fine powder into the air. I coughed, my eyes stinging, but I didn't stop. I swung again and again until chunks of plaster began to crumble away, revealing old bricks beneath. My muscles ached, and sweat dripped from my forehead, but adrenaline kept me going. When the plaster was gone, I stood before the rough, red bricks, breathing heavily. I ran my fingers over them, looking for any weakness. To my shock, one of the bricks shifted under my touch. I pushed harder, and it slid free, landing with a dull thud at my feet. Peering into the small hole, I saw darkness at first. Then, as my eyes adjusted, I noticed something. A faint shimmer of light from within. The whispers stopped abruptly, plunging the room into an almost oppressive silence. My chest felt tight, but I couldn't back out now. I removed another brick, then another, widening the hole until it was large enough to crawl through. The air beyond was stale, laced with a faint metallic tang that made me gag. The light inside flickered faintly, as if beckoning me forward. Swallowing my fear, I pulled myself through the gap and dropped down onto a hard, dusty floor. My knees buckled slightly, and I reached out to steady myself. The room was small, the walls lined with faded floral wallpaper that peeled in long, jagged strips. A single, dim bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a sickly yellow glow over the space. Then I saw them. The room was filled with old children's toys. Dusty teddy bears sat slumped against the walls, their glass eyes clouded and lifeless. Broken dolls lay scattered across the floor, their porcelain faces cracked and staring. A miniature tea set was arranged neatly on a low table, as though frozen in time. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stepped further into the room, my foot crunching on something brittle. I looked down and saw a small music box, its lid open. Suddenly, as if on cue, the box began to play. The same haunting melody I'd been hearing in the night. The sound filled the space, and I stumbled back, my pulse racing. Behind me, a faint scuttling sound broke the silence. My breath caught as I turned, my eyes scanning the room. The toys, they were moving. The headless doll on the floor twisted awkwardly, its shattered body lurching upright. The teddy bear's limbs twitched, and their glass eyes seemed to gleam with a strange, malicious light. "Max," the voice sang sweetly, now clearer than ever. "Come play with us." I stumbled back, the cold wall of the hidden room pressing against my spine. The toys were alive, or something far worse was animating them. The headless doll took halting, jerky steps toward me, its porcelain feet clicking on the floor. A teddy bear with one missing, I sat up straight, turning its stubby arms as if to welcome me. The air grew colder, sharper, biting at my skin like icy needles. The voice came again, but now it seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once, wrapping around me like smoke. "Max, stay with us. Don't leave. We've been so lonely." The music box continued its ghostly tune, and the toys gathered closer, their movements less erratic, more coordinated. My chest heaved as I struggled to breathe. Something about their hollow gazes seemed wrong, too focused, too intent. It felt like their eyes weren't just looking at me. They were looking through me. I stepped forward, desperate to leave the room, but my foot struck something. A small mirror, its surface tarnished and speckled with grime, sat propped against the wall. For a moment it drew me in. The toys froze, their movements halting mid-gesture as though the mirror's presence had seized their attention as well. My reflection wasn't right. The face staring back wasn't me, not entirely. The eyes were mine, yes, but they were wide, terrified, and filled with a pleading that chilled me to my core. My reflection moved before I did, its lips trembling as it mouthed words I couldn't hear. Then the rest of the mirror cleared, and I saw the reflection of the room. Only it wasn't empty. They were there. Children. Dozens of them. Pale, gaunt, and smeared with the grime of forgotten years. They stood behind me, their eyes hollow black pits, their mouths hanging open in soundless cries. Some clutched the toys that now moved on their own, as if their spirits were tethered to the lifeless objects. One child, a girl with matted hair and a threadbare dress, stepped closer to the mirror, her skeletal fingers pressing against the glass. I felt her cold breath on my neck. She opened her mouth, and for the first time, the words reached my ears. "Help us," she whispered, her voice layered with pain and fury. "Help us escape." Before I could respond, the toys sprang to life again, more violent this time. The teddy bear lunged, its stubby claws swiping at my leg. The headless doll leaped onto my shoulder, its broken body latching onto me with an unnatural grip. I screamed, thrashing, trying to shake them off. "Max!" The girl's voice cut through the chaos. "Break the mirror. Hurry!" Her voice was filled with urgency, but something in me hesitated. Breaking it might free them, or it might unleash something far worse. The toys dragged at me, pulling me toward the center of the room, where the music box's haunting tune grew louder, nearly deafening. The children in the mirror began to scream, their mouths stretching unnaturally wide as black liquid dripped from their eyes. The girl pressed her hand harder against the glass, her voice desperate and raw. "Break it, Max. Please." The girl's screams rattled in my skull, her voice rising above the cacophony of the music box and the chorus of whispers. The toys clawed and clung to me, their tiny limbs unnaturally strong. My pulse thundered in my ears as I staggered toward the tarnished mirror. The girl's face was pressed so close to the glass that her breath seemed to fog its surface. "Break it!" she cried again, her skeletal fingers banging against the other side of the mirror. I hesitated, dread pooling in my stomach. What if this was a trick? What if breaking the mirror would make everything worse? But as the headless doll clawed at my neck and the teddy bear's glassy eye fixed on mine, I realized I had no other choice. Gripping the mop handle with both hands, I raised it high above my head. The girl's mouth opened in a silent scream as if bracing for what was to come. I swung the handle down with all my strength, and the mirror shattered with a deafening crash. The room erupted into chaos. A blinding light spilled from the broken shards, washing over the toys and sending them into spasms. The music box screeched to a halt, its haunting melody replaced by a high-pitched wail. The air grew thick and electric, crackling with unseen energy. The children in the mirror's reflection were no longer trapped. They appeared around me, their translucent forms shimmering like heat waves. Their hollow eyes bore into mine, filled with a mix of sorrow and gratitude. The girl stepped forward, her tiny hand reaching out to touch my arm. Her fingers felt cold, yet strangely comforting. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice faint now, almost lost in the roar of the room. One by one, the children began to fade, their forms dissolving into streaks of light that disappeared into the cracks and corners of the space. The girl lingered a moment longer, her dark eyes softening as she gave me a faint, sad smile. Then she too was gone. The room fell silent, save for my ragged breathing. The toys lay lifeless around me, their glass eyes and porcelain faces blank once more. The oppressive cold lifted, replaced by a strange warmth that filled the air. I dropped the mop handle, my hands trembling, and stared at the broken mirror. It now reflected nothing but the room itself, empty and unremarkable. My relief was short-lived. From somewhere deep within the walls, a low, guttural growl began to build, vibrating through the floor and into my bones. The air grew thick again, this time with a suffocating sense of dread. Whatever I had freed, it wasn't finished. I stumbled backward, my gaze darting around the room. The growling grew louder, morphing into a deep, guttural laugh that echoed in the tiny space. My stomach twisted as a new voice spoke, raspy and inhuman. "You think you've won, Max?" It sneered. "You've only just begun to play." The light bulb flickered wildly, plunging the room into darkness. My breath caught as a pair of glowing, crimson eyes appeared in the shadows, staring directly at me. The glowing red eyes burned into me from the darkness, their light flickering like dying embers. My body froze, every muscle paralyzed with fear. The air in the room felt heavier, pressing down on my chest like a physical weight. Somewhere in the shadows, the guttural laugh returned, curling around me like smoke. "You've set them free," the voice snarled, its tone dripping with mockery. "But you've left the door wide open. For me." A sudden, deafening slam echoed through the hidden room as the hole in the wall sealed itself shut. I spun around, my escape cut off. The bricks moved as though alive, fitting seamlessly together until no trace of the gap remained. I clawed at the wall, my fingernails scraping uselessly against the cold stone. "Where do you think you're going?" The voice was closer now, just behind me. I turned slowly, my breath hitching as I saw it emerge from the shadows. The figure was humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong. Its limbs were unnaturally long and thin, its fingers tipped with sharp, glinting claws. The crimson eyes sat in a face too smooth, too polished, like porcelain stretched unnaturally over a skull. A jagged smile split its face, revealing teeth that gleamed like shards of glass. "You should have stayed quiet, Max," it hissed, its voice resonating like a distant scream. "You shouldn't have listened to the children." I stumbled back, my heel catching on the edge of the music box. The creature's smile widened as it stepped closer, its movements fluid and deliberate. I fumbled for the broken mop handle, my trembling hands barely able to grip it. What do you want?" I stammered, raising the makeshift weapon. The creature tilted its head, the movement eerily animalistic. "What do I want?" It laughed again, a sound that scraped against my eardrums. "I want to play, Max. I've been trapped in the dark for so long, and you've set me free." The air around it rippled, the shadows thickening and twisting like living things. My mind screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The walls seemed to close in, and the temperature plummeted, frost forming on the edges of the shattered mirror. "You're going to stay here with me," it whispered, its voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "Forever."
"No,"
I shouted, lunging forward with the mop handle. I swung it wildly, the broken wood catching the creature in the side. It let out an ear-splitting screech, stumbling back as black ichor oozed from the wound. Its smile vanished, replaced by a snarl of rage. "You'll pay for that," it spat, its claws scraping against the floor as it lunged toward me. I dove to the side, narrowly avoiding its attack. My heart pounded as I scrambled to my feet, my gaze darting around the room for something, anything, that could help. My eyes landed on the remnants of the mirror, shards of glass glittering on the ground like fallen stars. The creature followed my gaze, its red eyes narrowing. "Don't even think about it, Max." But I didn't hesitate. I dropped to my knees, snatching up the largest shard of glass. Pain shot through my hand as the jagged edge sliced into my palm, but I held on tight. The creature lunged again, and this time I was ready. With all the strength I could muster, I plunged the shard into its chest. The creature froze, its eyes widening in shock. For a moment, it seemed almost human, its expression flickering with something like fear. Then it let out a shriek so piercing it made my ears bleed. The shadows writhed violently, collapsing inward as the creature's form disintegrated into black smoke. The crimson eyes were the last to fade, their glow extinguished with a final, echoing whisper. This isn't over. The room fell silent once more, the oppressive weight lifting as the last of the creature disappeared. I collapsed onto the floor, my chest heaving, the shard of glass slipping from my bloody hand. The walls around me began to crumble, revealing the familiar, sterile light of the psychiatric ward. But as I lay there, gasping for breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. I lay sprawled on the cold, dusty floor, the faint hum of fluorescent lights from the psychiatric ward filtering through the crumbling walls. My chest rose and fell as I struggled to catch my breath, my mind reeling from what had just happened. The creature was gone, its jagged smile and glowing red eyes nothing more than a memory, or so I hoped. But the feeling of being watched lingered, an invisible weight pressing down on me. My eyes darted to the corners of the room, expecting the shadows to spring to life again, but they remained still. The toys were lifeless now, lying scattered and broken, their haunting vitality drained away. Yet the silence felt wrong, as if the room itself was holding its breath. "Max!" a faint voice whispered from the hallway beyond the wall. My stomach twisted as I recognized it, the same sing-song tone that had first drawn me to the wall. "Don't go. We're not finished yet." Panic surged through me, and I scrambled to my feet. The hidden room felt suffocating, its walls seeming to close in with every passing second. The jagged hole in the wall, the one I'd clawed through to enter this nightmare, was back. The bricks somehow reset as if I'd never touched them. I didn't question it. I ran for the opening, squeezing my body through the narrow gap and tumbling back into my room. The harsh, sterile light of St. Helena's was almost blinding after the dim glow of the hidden chamber. For a moment, I just lay there on the linoleum floor, my pulse hammering in my ears. "Mox!" a voice called from the hallway, and I jerked my head toward the door. Greg, the orderly, stood there, his expression shifting from annoyance to concern as he took in my disheveled state. "What the hell happened to you?" My voice cracked, my throat dry. "There's something in the wall." Greg sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "We've been through this, man. There's nothing in the wall. You've got to stop letting your imagination run wild." "No, you don't understand," I shouted, pushing myself to my feet. "There's a room behind the plaster. I saw it. There were toys, and a thing." Greg's brow furrowed. He stepped into the room, glancing around as if expecting to find evidence of my claims. His gaze lingered on the wall I'd broken through. To my shock, the plaster was intact, smooth and unblemished. Not a single crack betrayed the chaos I'd unleashed. "Max," he said, his tone firm but cautious. "You need to calm down. Whatever you think you saw, it's not real. You've been under a lot of stress." I shook my head violently. "I'm not making this up. You have to believe me." He sighed, his expression softening. "Look, I'll get Nurse Evelyn to check on you. Okay? Maybe she can—" "Greg," I interrupted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Do you feel that?" He frowned. "Feel what?" The temperature in the room had plummeted again, the air carrying a biting chill that made my breath fog. The shadows along the wall began to ripple, shifting and twisting like living things. Greg froze, his eyes widening as the oppressive atmosphere pressed down on us both. "What the—" he started, but his words were drowned out by a familiar sound, a low, guttural growl, echoing from deep within the wall. My stomach dropped as the voice returned, colder and sharper than before. "You thought you could escape, Max?" it hissed. "You brought me here." The wall behind me trembled, the plaster cracking as something began to push through. Greg stumbled back, his face pale, as a clawed hand emerged from the wall, its fingers curling and scraping against the air. "Run," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Greg, run." But he was rooted to the spot, his gaze fixed on the growing fissure in the wall as the creature began to emerge. The plaster splintered like brittle bones as the creature forced its way through the wall. Crimson eyes burned brighter than ever, cutting through the dim light of the room. Its jagged smile reappeared, stretching unnaturally wide across its porcelain-like face. Its claws scraped against the cracked surface of the wall, leaving deep, jagged grooves as it fully emerged. Greg's breathing was ragged, his wide eyes locked on the impossible sight before him. What the hell is that?" he stammered, his voice barely audible. "Greg," I shouted, grabbing his arm and yanking him toward the door. "We have to get out of here." But the creature moved faster. Its long, spindly limbs shot forward, blocking our path. The room seemed to warp around it, the air growing thick and dark, swallowing the fluorescent light. Greg let out a strangled cry, his panic spilling over as he stumbled backward into the corner. "You can't run," the creature hissed, its voice a mix of guttural snarls and cruel laughter. "You belong to me now." I stepped in front of Greg, clutching the jagged shard of glass I'd carried from the hidden room. My hands shook, but I held the shard tightly, ignoring the sting of fresh cuts reopening on my palm. "Stay back," I warned, though my voice betrayed my fear. The creature tilted its head, amusement flickering in its crimson eyes. "How brave," it mocked. "But bravery won't save you." It lunged, its claws slicing through the air with a sound like tearing fabric. I ducked, barely avoiding the swipe, and swung the glass shard with all my strength. It struck the creature's arm, cutting deep, and black ichor spilled onto the floor, hissing and smoking where it landed. The creature howled in fury, its smile twisting into a snarl. "You dare defy me?" it bellowed, the room trembling with the force of its voice. "Greg, move!" I yelled, grabbing his arm again. This time, he seemed to snap out of his paralysis, and together we bolted for the door. The hallway was eerily quiet, the usual hum of the hospital drowned out by the pounding of our footsteps. Behind us, the creature's guttural growl echoed, growing louder with every step we took. The shadows along the corridor writhed unnaturally, stretching toward us like claws. "Where do we go?" Greg gasped, his face slick with sweat. "Where the hell do we go?" "The nurse's station," I shouted, adrenaline propelling me forward. "We need to find Evelyn. She knows something about this." We rounded a corner, nearly colliding with a cart of medical supplies. The creature's growls were closer now, its heavy footsteps reverberating through the walls. Greg tripped, falling hard onto the linoleum floor, and I skidded to a stop, reaching down to help him up. "Come on, Greg," I urged, my voice trembling. "We're almost there." But before he could stand, the shadows surged forward, wrapping around his ankle like living ropes. He screamed, his nails scraping against the floor as he was dragged backward. "No!" I yelled, grabbing his arm and pulling with all my strength. The creature appeared at the end of the hall, its crimson eyes glowing with malevolent glee. "Let him go!" I shouted, my voice cracking. The creature laughed, a sound that sent ice down my spine. "You can't save him, Max," it taunted. "You couldn't save the others, either." With a final, desperate yank, Greg's hand slipped from mine, and the shadows swallowed him whole. His scream echoed through the corridor before abruptly cutting off, leaving only silence. I stumbled back, my chest heaving, tears burning my eyes. The creature's crimson gaze turned to me, its smile widening. "You're next." Greg's scream echoed in my mind, even though the hallway had fallen silent. The shadows had devoured him, leaving nothing behind, not even a trace of his existence. The creature loomed at the far end of the corridor, its red eyes locked onto me, its jagged smile stretching wider. My legs trembled, but instinct screamed louder than fear. I ran. The hallway seemed endless, the fluorescent lights overhead flickering as though they were caught in the same nightmare. Doors to patient rooms blurred past me, each one feeling like a trap rather than an escape. The air grew colder with every step, and the shadows seemed alive, twisting and writhing along the walls, creeping closer with each passing second. "Run, Max," the creature's voice hissed, its tone playful and cruel. There's nowhere to go. The hallway forked ahead, and I skidded into the turn, nearly losing my footing. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound drowning out all rational thought. I needed to find someone, anyone, but the ward felt deserted, abandoned. The lights ahead began to fail entirely, leaving the path in darkness. I clutched the shard of glass tighter, its jagged edges cutting into my palm, grounding me. Couldn't stop. Stopping meant death or worse. Behind me, the creature's footsteps echoed, slow and deliberate. It wasn't running. It didn't need to. It knew I couldn't escape. "You'll tire soon, Max," it taunted. "And when you do, I'll be waiting." I rounded another corner and spotted the nurse's station at the end of the hall. Relief surged through me like electricity. Nurse Evelyn. She had to be there. She knew about the renovations, about the room. If anyone could help me, it was her. I threw myself against the counter, my lungs burning, and looked around. The station was empty, save for the clutter of paperwork and the sterile smell of disinfectant. "Evelyn," I shouted, my voice raw. "Please, I need help." The creature's laughter echoed faintly, a mocking sound that sent chills down my spine. It was getting closer. Desperation clawed at my chest as I searched the desk, pulling open drawers and scattering their contents. There had to be something, anything, I could use. My hands found a flashlight, its metal surface cold and solid. I flicked it on, the beam slicing through the shadows. Clutching it tightly, I backed away from the station, my eyes darting to the corridor I'd come from. The lights at the far end flickered violently, casting brief, distorted glimpses of the creature as it emerged from the darkness. It moved slowly, its claws scraping against the walls, its crimson eyes fixed on me. "Nowhere left to hide," it purred. I raised the flashlight, aiming the beam directly at its face. The light struck it, and for the first time, it recoiled, hissing as though the beam burned its pale, porcelain-like skin. Its red eyes narrowed, and it shielded itself with one spindly arm. It was enough. I turned and ran again, the flashlight cutting through the dark hallway like a lifeline. My mind raced as I tried to think of where to go, but every corner felt like it brought me closer to a dead end. A faint noise caught my attention, a rhythmic tapping, soft and deliberate. I followed the sound, my breath shallow and quick. The tapping grew louder as I approached the source, and I realized with a jolt that it was coming from behind a door marked "Maintenance." I hesitated, my hand hovering over the knob. The tapping continued, steady and unrelenting. Behind me, the creature's growls grew louder, echoing through the hall like a distant storm. With no other choice, I turned the handle and slipped inside, closing the door softly behind me. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a single, flickering bulb. The space was cluttered with tools, spare parts, and cleaning supplies. But what caught my attention immediately was the figure crouched in the corner. It was Evelyn. She was sitting on the floor, her arms wrapped around her knees, tapping a wrench rhythmically against the wall. Her eyes were wide and unfocused, her lips moving as if she were whispering something to herself. "Evelyn," I whispered, stepping closer. "What are you doing here?" Her gaze snapped to me, her expression a mix of terror and relief. "You shouldn't have gone into the wall," she hissed. "You've made it worse." "What is it?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "What have I done?" Her face crumpled, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You've brought it here." Evelyn's whispered words hung in the air like a death knell. "You've brought it here." Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she clutched the wrench like a talisman. "What do you mean I brought it?" I demanded, my voice sharp with panic. "What is that thing?" Her eyes darted to the door as though expecting it to burst open at any second. "It's not supposed to leave the wall," she said, her voice cracking. "That's why they sealed the room. That's why they built over it. But you broke the barrier." "I didn't know," I shouted, my voice rising. The whispers, the singing. It was calling me. That's how it works, she snapped, her voice suddenly fierce. It preys on the curious, the desperate. It tricks you into opening the door, and once you do, she trailed off, her gaze dropping to the floor. Once you do, it can follow you anywhere. A loud thud echoed from the hallway outside, and we both froze. The creature was close, its guttural growls vibrating through the walls. Evelyn scrambled to her feet, her grip on the wrench tightening. It wants to feed, she whispered, her voice barely audible. It thrives on fear, pain. It doesn't just kill, it consumes. Then how do we stop it? I asked, my pulse hammering in my ears. There has to be a way. Evelyn shook her head, her eyes filled with despair. You can't stop it. You can only trap it again. How? I demanded, stepping closer. Tell me how. She hesitated, her gaze flickering to the floor. The mirror, she said finally. It's a gateway, a tether to its prison. That's why it was in the room. It's the only thing that can draw it back. But the mirror's broken, I said, panic rising in my chest. That doesn't matter, she replied quickly. The shards still hold its essence. If you can lure it to the pieces, it will be pulled back. But, her voice faltered and she looked away. But it won't go willingly. The door rattled violently, the creature's claws scraping against the wood. Evelyn and I both jumped, the sound tearing through the small room like a scream. Her eyes met mine, and I saw the fear mirrored in her face. It's here, she whispered. Max, you have to decide. Fight or run. Another thud, louder this time, and the door began to splinter. The shadows crept in under the gap, snaking across the floor like living things. I gripped the flashlight tighter, my other hand reaching for a wrench from the nearby workbench. We fight, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. But you have to help me. Evelyn nodded reluctantly, stepping beside me. We get it to the shards, she said. But it won't follow unless it feels threatened. The door burst open, the creature stepping inside. Its crimson eyes burned with rage, its jagged smile stretching impossibly wide. The temperature in the room plummeted, frost forming on the walls and floor. It let out a low, menacing growl, its claws flexing as it advanced. You can't hide from me, Max. It hissed, its voice cutting through the air like a blade. I'll find you no matter where you run. Evelyn stepped forward, holding her wrench like a weapon. Then come and get us, you bastard, she spat. The creature's head snapped toward her, its smile twisting into a snarl. With a deafening roar, it lunged. The creature's lunge was impossibly fast, its claws slicing through the air. Evelyn and I dove in opposite directions, its strike missing us by inches. The wrench in her hand clattered to the floor as she scrambled to her feet, her wide eyes locked on the monster. The room seemed to darken further, the shadows pooling around the creature like ink spreading through water. Get to the shards, Evelyn shouted, her voice cracking. I'll distract it. No, I yelled back. We do this together. The creature twisted its head unnaturally, its crimson gaze darting between us. You're both mine? It growled, the words slithering into my ears like venom. It swiped at Evelyn again, but she ducked, grabbing another wrench from the workbench and swinging it with surprising force. The blow connected with its arm, sending a spray of black ichor across the floor. The creature howled in fury, its body recoiling. Move, she screamed, and I didn't hesitate. I bolted for the hallway, my flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive dark. The shards of the mirror were still where I'd left them, glittering faintly on the linoleum floor like fragments of a broken star. The creature's footsteps thundered behind me, its guttural growls shaking the very air. I skidded to a stop, dropping to my knees and fumbling with the shards. They were jagged and cold, each one cutting into my fingers as I arranged them in a rough circle. My hands trembled, blood smearing the edges of the glass. Evelyn's screams echoed from the room behind me, sharp and desperate. My stomach twisted, guilt clawing at my insides. I looked back, my heart pounding, but I couldn't see her through the shadows that now consumed the hallway. "Come on," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Come on, you bastard. Come get me." The creature's growl grew louder, its glowing eyes cutting through the dark. It emerged from the shadows, its jagged smile dripping with malice. Evelyn stumbled into view behind it, clutching her arm, her face pale with pain. "You think this will stop me?" the creature hissed, its voice a guttural snarl. "You're nothing, Max. Nothing but fear." I stood, holding the largest shard of the mirror in front of me like a weapon. "You're wrong," I said, my voice shaking. "I'm not afraid of you." The creature laughed, a sound that vibrated through my bones. "Liar." With a roar, it charged, its claws outstretched. At the last second, I stepped back, dropping the shard into the circle with a clatter. The creature froze mid-lunge, its crimson eyes widening as the shards began to glow, their fractured edges pulsing with an eerie light. "No!" it bellowed, its voice echoing through the hallway. It writhed, its long limbs flailing as the light from the shards intensified, enveloping it. Evelyn stumbled toward me, her face illuminated by the strange glow. "It's working," she whispered, her voice filled with awe and terror. The creature's form began to distort, its jagged smile and crimson eyes twisting into a grotesque blur. It let out one final, ear-splitting screech as the shards pulled it inward, dragging it back into the mirror's fractured prison. The glow dimmed, then vanished entirely, leaving the hallway silent and dark. Evelyn and I stood frozen, our breaths ragged, the shards of the mirror now dull and lifeless. The oppressive cold lifted, replaced by a strange stillness that felt almost peaceful. "Did we?" I began, but the words caught in my throat. "It's gone," Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For now." The silence in the hallway was suffocating, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Evelyn and I stood over the shattered remnants of the mirror, our bodies trembling from exhaustion and fear. The creature was gone, dragged back into the fragments that now lay scattered at our feet. "For now," Evelyn had said, but her words offered no comfort. The oppressive air of the hospital began to lift, the fluorescent lights flickering back to life above us. The world felt strangely normal again, though the chill of the creature's presence lingered like a ghost in my bones. "We need to get rid of these," Evelyn said, kneeling beside the shards. Her hands hovered over them, hesitant to touch the glass. "If even one remains, it could come back." I nodded, but something felt wrong. My gaze drifted to the largest shard, the one I'd held earlier. Its surface, though tarnished and cracked, still shimmered faintly. My breath caught as I leaned closer. "Evelyn," I whispered, my voice tight. "Look." Her eyes followed mine, and her face paled. Within the shard, the creature's crimson eyes stared back, glowing faintly in the fractured glass. Its jagged smile stretched impossibly wide as its distorted face pressed against the reflective surface, as though testing the barrier. "It's still here," I said, my voice trembling. "It's not gone." Evelyn scrambled to her feet, backing away from the shard. "We have to destroy it completely," she said, panic creeping into her voice. "Every piece." I reached down to pick up the shard, but the moment my fingers brushed its edge, a searing pain shot through my hand. I recoiled, clutching my palm as black veins began to creep up my arm, branching like roots beneath my skin. My head swam, and a low, guttural voice echoed in my mind. "You can't escape me, Max."
No.
I screamed, shaking my head. The voice grew louder, a cacophony of whispers and laughter that clawed at my sanity. The shard glowed brighter, the creature's form pressing harder against the glass, as if it were trying to break through. Evelyn grabbed a nearby fire extinguisher and swung it with all her strength, smashing it into the shard. The glass shattered into 1,000 tiny pieces, scattering across the floor like a burst of stars. The glow faded instantly, and the black veins on my arm receded, leaving my skin raw and tingling. "Are you okay?" Evelyn asked, dropping the extinguisher and rushing to my side. I nodded shakily, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "I think so, but is it gone?" We both stared at the tiny fragments of glass, now dull and lifeless. The creature's voice had vanished, and the oppressive chill was gone. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching, waiting. "We can't leave anything behind," Evelyn said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. She grabbed a dustpan from the maintenance room and began sweeping up the shards. "We'll burn them, every last piece." We made our way to the hospital's incinerator, a small room tucked away in the basement. The air was thick with heat and the acrid smell of burning waste. Evelyn dumped the shards into the incinerator's maw, and I watched as the flames consumed them, their edges curling and melting into nothing. For a moment, the tension lifted. It was over, finally truly over. But as we turned to leave, a faint, familiar whisper brushed against my ear. "Max?" I spun around, my heart hammering, but the room was empty. The incinerator roared on, its flames dancing innocently, and Evelyn stared at me with a mix of confusion and concern. "What is it?" she asked. "Nothing," I lied, forcing a weak smile. "Let's get out of here." As we walked back through the sterile halls of St. Helena's, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a mistake. The creature was gone, or at least most of it was, but I couldn't forget the whisper, the way it lingered in the air like smoke. Somewhere, deep within the shadows, I knew it was still watching, waiting for me. Thank you for listening to my story. Like it if you liked it and write in the comments if it was creepy or not.